Good afternoon and welcome. Thanks everyone. I'm Tessa Boyd-Kane. I'm CEO of ANROSE, Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here today to this incredibly important piece of research that we are launching. I want to begin by acknowledging country. We meet in person here on the lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. I want to recognise the continuing connection to country and pay my respects to elders past and present of the Wurundjeri Nation. We did invite local elders to welcome us to country today, and they weren't able to be with us. And in recognising the cultural load that elders in particular in this country play, the load that they carry for all of us, I want to respect that ongoing commitment from all of us to recognise and to respect country, but also to walk alongside and stand behind the leadership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly as we think about the continuing impacts of gendered violence in this country. We've got a group of people joining us here in person who we're delighted to be able to connect with, but we've also got a fantastic community of people joining us from right around the country online. And so to those of us joining online, welcome. I want to give you the opportunity to acknowledge country that you're joining us from as well, and we're really delighted to have you with us as we move through this event today. ANROSE has been building evidence over the past 12 years across a whole range of fronts. And formally our role is to build evidence in support of the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. And over that 12 years, we've developed about 150 collaborations and evidence driven either through work we've done ourselves or often in partnership and through collaboration with a whole network of researchers. And often when we talk about that work, we name domestic, family and sexual violence as the context that we're talking about in terms of gendered violence. And I sometimes find myself in conversations, particularly around what's happening in workplaces, particularly around sexual harassment, where the first thing we need to do is recognise why sexual harassment plays such an important role in our understanding of gendered violence. And for many people here this afternoon, this won't be news, but it is important to always remember that we're thinking and talking about and responding to the attitudes and the behaviours in which gendered violence occurs. And those attitudes and behaviours are carried by us into workplaces, just as they're brought into homes, just as they're brought into community relationships at all levels. So for us, understanding the dynamics of sexual harassment, hearing directly from the voices of people who've experienced sexual harassment, and thinking at a workplace, at a sector and at a systems level about how we end sexual harassment is a really critical part of the work that we need to do in this country to end gendered violence. And that's why I'm so delighted that we're here today releasing this very important research that really brings together a whole lot of thinking about gendered violence and reflects the intersections in which gendered violence occurs for many women in this country. In order to understand what that research tells us, I'm absolutely delighted now to introduce our key researchers for this work today, Professor Marie Seagrave and Dr. Siru Tan. Marie Seagrave is an ARC Future Fellow in the School of Political and Social Sciences in the Faculty of Arts. Marie has led major international as well as national studies that broadly focus on women's safety and security in the context of gendered violence, and her work includes funding from the ARC, the Australian Research Council here, but also the International Labour Organisation and UN Women. Marie's published widely, and her forthcoming book on the borders of violence offers a detailed examination of the relationship between borders and gendered violence. Marie co-leads the Border, Migration and Gendered Violence Research Hub, also with Siru, which brings together researchers within and beyond the University of Melbourne leading critical national and international research in this area. Marie's research is closely linked to advocacy and to transforming policy to better secure women's safety, and you'll see that in spades in this work that we're talking about this afternoon. Joining Marie is Dr. Siru Tan, a lecturer in criminology at the School of Social and Political Sciences, also at the University of Melbourne, and director of the Borders, Migration and Gendered Violence Research Hub. Siru's work is intersectional and broadly concerned with the intersections of gender, migration and harm of state systems for experiences of women migrants from all backgrounds, particularly in the context of family, work and employment. Thank you, Marie and Siru.
Thank you, Tessa. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today, the people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to recognise the ongoing reckoning with our past and our future. I'd like to thank the University of Melbourne for the support for the launch today, and the work of Anne Rose and the team in particular who we've been working so closely with over the last almost 2 years during the research and definitely in preparation for today. It's a lot of unseen work, but it's critical and we thank them for all of that effort. It has been my privilege to lead this project, but I've worked, of course, with a brilliant team. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-lead, Dr. Siru Tan, who I'll hand over to in a moment, as well as the wonderful Nuria Alarcon Lopez from Harmony Alliance, and to recognise my excellent Griffith colleagues, Professor Rebecca Wicks and Dr. Chloe Keel. This work, of course, would not be possible without our advisory group, some of whom are here today. But most importantly, this work wouldn't be possible without the generosity and trust of many migrant and refugee women across Australia who shared with us their experiences in the workplace and beyond, all of whom were invited to join us today in whatever capacity they could. This research was driven by a broad commitment across the team to recognise that we need deep and careful research to understand better the breadth and depth of women's experiences of safety in the workplace. And it is, of course, our hope that the findings we are sharing today contribute to a more nuanced and careful consideration of what safety looks like for women across Australia. This is research that sought to do many things. Last year, we released the survey results separately, in part because we wanted to build a bigger report that allowed for us to deeply engage with women to better understand and interpret those findings. That is reflected in the size of the report and the significant amount of quotes that ensure that we're allowed to give voice to what women said to us rather than trying to rephrase it and reframe it. We are of the firm view that this report should be the beginning of a conversation. It holds up some challenges to what we think we know. It suggests that existing structures and silos are inadvertently creating and sustaining silence around the ways in which women are made to be unsafe at work. And I specifically refer to the ways that women are made to be unsafe, not the way they feel. It's incredibly important to reflect on the ways in which women's experiences can be dismissed as a feeling that doesn't equate to an objective review of any situation or context. In our report, we repeatedly highlight the ways in which women are told their experiences or perspective is incorrect, it needs adjustment, and or it is their failing or their responsibility, or that it's an indication that they do not belong or that their values or cultural radar is off. This is not exclusive to the experience of migrant and refugee women, but there are very specific ways in which it impacts this group, and it is critical to pay attention to that. Our findings and recommendations lead with the concept of safe work. Existing evidence suggests that disempowerment and power imbalances, such as those related to race, gender, disability, sexuality, can amplify the impacts of workplace harassment. Simultaneously, power imbalances can conceal both the harassment itself as well as those it impacts. Across our research, women focused on safety, which was not simply about their personal or physical safety. It was about their job security, about their visa status. It was about the shame and blame that would be attributed to them by their community, despite being the target of abuse. We want to lead with and also end with the importance of thinking about safe work. And I'll hand over to my colleague to walk through some of the details and more findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. So good afternoon, everyone. Really very happy to see everyone here today. Thank you all for joining us, both in person and online, and also to everyone who made this research possible. So I'll now like to share some key findings with you from the report. And so you will come to know that it's really much of a broad overview, but this report was designed to privilege women's voices as much as possible. And this is also why in the report you will find that we have shared direct quotes from participants that offer important details and context to the findings that I'll now briefly talk to. So one of the key findings from our study is that there is a lot of focus on identifying workplace sexual harassment. The research highlighted that women were often uncertain about what counts as workplace sexual harassment. And many of them reflected or talked about anxieties of whether they were overthinking or that, they just couldn't take a joke. While women didn't talk specifically about workplace sexual harassment, they spoke about behaviors that made them feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And so, what we found to be quite important is that the current approach of detailing specific behaviors perhaps warrants some careful review with a more careful and nuanced consideration of women's safety or what counts as women's safety. Second, around 46% of participants in our survey, so that was the first stage of the study, had experienced workplace sexual harassment. However, this was not often experienced in isolation. We found in the survey and also in focus groups that experiences of workplace sexual harassment was consistently alongside exploitative work conditions such as underpayment, overworking, as well as discrimination based on race or gender. In this context, women often reflected that workplace sexual harassment was not a single issue, but an extension of other unsafe work practices. We found that regardless of industry, education, employment status, or length of employment, racism, both overt and implicit, was part of women's experiences of work. And this has myriad impacts, ranging from women adopting their view of the experience or the situation to ensuring that women did not report the experience because of fears that they would not be believed. The third finding that we had was that men were most frequently the harassers, and they were most often in senior positions or were clients or customers. We point out that the power imbalances inherent in those gender and workplaces positions impacted whether and how women disclose experiences of being unsafe. This finding also really very much challenges the assumption that, that simply affirming particular behaviors as being sexual harassment is a key way for women to report. That is, it's not simply enough to educate people about what is workplace sexual harassment and take that as a strategy to stop or prevent such things from happening. There are many other factors that contribute to sustaining workplace sexual harassment and to ensuring that women remain unwilling or unable to disclose or complain. I particularly want to highlight how varied these experiences were. For some women who shared a religious or ethnic background with the perpetrator, they reflected that this was leveraged by perpetrators to exercise power, often with impunity, because they would weaponize culturally grounded beliefs or standards that were not understood by others outside of the community. Other women reported that they felt that they were being targeted because the perpetrator knew that the consequences for women for speaking out would be felt far beyond the workplace and have potentially negative impacts on their visa and economic security, as well as their family and community standing. So this points to the importance of highlighting the relationship between personal and workplace safety, that these are not separate spaces and therefore should not be seen as divided or seen in isolation. And the final area of finding that I would like to point us to today is that women consistently reported that their actions or inactions in response to feeling unsafe and to experiencing workplace sexual harassment most often tended to have negative impacts for their mental and physical well-being. In consequence, many women indicated that they would often, they did leave a workplace because of harassment and feeling unsafe, even though doing so would leave them in a state of deep precarity. This points to the need for us to consider carefully how we monitor women's employment, movement, and why women leave workplaces. Women have also managed their safety in a few other ways, such as trying to ignore the behaviors, actively taking measures to protect themselves, for example, avoiding being in the same space as perpetrators, and less commonly directly confronting the perpetrator. But a related issue is that even when women had taken actions, workplaces were largely silent on misbehavior and sexual harassment. So there was a consistent view in our research that there was just generally an absence of any formal recognition or consequence of perpetrators' wrongdoing. More commonly, they would be quietly moved elsewhere and/or to other parts of the organization. And this has serious impacts for women affected, and more broadly for women across the workforce who do not see any recognition of unacceptable workplace behaviors or any consequences for perpetrators that would encourage them to speak up. So in this research, again, we have sought to privilege women's voices and to illuminate the complexity of workplace sexual harassment in women's working and personal lives. This is the first national study that has focused on migrant and refugee women's experiences, attitudes, and experiences to workplace sexual harassment. And it's our sincere hope that this lays the solid foundation from which to challenge assumptions regarding best practice systems, national approaches to research, and who is responsible for workplace sexual harassment. Thank you.
At ANROS, we often get asked what works, excuse me, and particularly in this heightened moment that we've been experiencing over the past few months with this, I think, heightened attention to experience that has been, the experience of gendered violence in this country in a way that we haven't really recognised the severity of it adequately to date. And so this question about what works comes up often, and that's particularly in the context of programs that are about supporting victims and survivors, but also increasingly that interest about how we work with perpetrators. And one of the things that we always want to remind people is it's not just what works, it's what works for whom, in what context, with what supports, and recognising what they need at what point in time. So context really matters. And what I think is so important about this work is that clarity about context in shaping that experience that women particularly are experiencing in terms of sexual harassment at work, but also that if our responses at a system and at a workplace, at a sector and at an individual level, if our responses don't take account of that context, then they fail. Then they're not set up to do what's needed. And so I really want to thank you, Marie and Siru and the research team, all of the participants who've fed such critical insight into the work, because understanding what it looks like for our responses to take account of that context has to be a really critical pathway to making sure that we do better in terms of the support that we provide, the responses that we bring, and our work to stop and end this form of gendered violence. No better speaker then to keep the conversation moving than Dr. Anna Cody, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner. Anna started as Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner in September 2023. Before that, she had a distinguished career as an academic, a lawyer specialising in discrimination, and a passionate advocate for human rights. Her work over the years has included substantial advocacy to various United Nations human rights committees when they have reviewed Australia's and other nations' fulfilment of their human rights obligations. And most recently, she was Dean of the School of Law and Professor at Western Sydney University, leading the education and research impact within the school to better reflect the diversity of the community and the intersection of law and justice. So I'll invite Anna now to talk to us about advancing the National Research and Policy Agenda in relation to workplace sexual harassment. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay my respect to elders past and present, and also any First Nations people who are here today or are joining us online. And it is a pleasure to join with you today to launch the Migrant and Refugee Women, a national study of experiences of, understandings of and responses to sexual harassment in the workplace. I congratulate Professor Marie Seagrave, Dr. Siru Tan and all of the team at the University of Melbourne, at Griffith University and the partners at Harmony Alliance, and also at ANROS, and particularly you, Dr. Tessa Boyd-Kane. It's really exciting to read the report, and I have actually read the whole thing from cover to cover. And what the report demonstrates is one key piece and other key findings as outlined by Dr. Siru Tan. And that is around the experience of migrant and refugee women experiencing intersecting or complex forms of workplace harms. It recognises the importance of looking at exploitive work conditions, sexual harassment and racial discrimination, and that they all happen together, and that we need to deal with these together and not separately. That also there is uncertainty about what workplace sexual harassment is. We heard of harassers explaining away instances of sexual harassment as just a joke or part of the Australian culture, and many workers who experience this who don't know who they can talk to about it or how to get support or how to deal with it. Many who experience this are very concerned about the risk to their community's reputation if they were to talk about it, also worried about losing their job, with a clear priority to keep their job in a context where employment discrimination, particularly on the basis of race, is common. And we also learnt about workplaces failing to properly prevent and respond to instances of workplace sexual harassment, which require that more complex intersectional approach. These findings reflect what we're hearing from refugee and migrant women as part of the Commission's Speaking from Experience project, a project that we're leading at the Australian Human Rights Commission for the last 18 months. We're holding in-person consultations across all states and territories to hear the voices of diverse groups and their experiences of workplace sexual harassment so that we can shape current approaches. In particular, we're hearing from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers, young people, culturally and racially marginalised workers, people with disability and LGBTQI+ workers, as well as other groups targeted by harassers. We know that culturally, racially marginalised communities aren't homogenous. And we know that the workplace sexual harassment that they experience and the impact that it has on women's life is influenced by a range of cultural, social, emotional and financial factors. Some of the clear action needed we've identified includes a focus on prevention through community education, and that includes a racialised sexual harassment understanding and using examples of that and the range of ways that people experience it. We need to make that education more accessible. We need to have straightforward workplace sexual harassment policies. We need to have clear complaint processes and avenues for support. We had a really interesting discussion earlier at the workshop about the interaction between individual responses and systemic and how the two need to go hand in hand. We need to be able to provide support through a broad range of organisations and community groups, places where migrant and refugee communities seek support on how to prevent and respond to workplace sexual harassment. And on that systemic level, looking for greater diversity and cultural safety within the workplace, and that includes much more diverse representation within management, within our supervisors, within our boards, within our CEOs. Part of that action that we discussed in the workshop earlier today and is recommended in the report also includes reducing the siloed nature of the policy areas, the siloed nature of the frameworks and the structures that seek to address various forms of workplace harm for migrant and refugee women. That can be our vision, it can be our dream, and in the meantime working out from within so that those become much more inclusive. I welcome this work and the continued conversation that we can all share and how we can effectively respond in an intersectional and complex way to the experiences of migrant, refugee, culturally and racially marginalised and First Nations women, women with disability and LGBTQI+ communities, as well as shifting the burden from women to workplaces and to perpetrators. So I again congratulate you, the researchers, on this important work, and Anne Rose, and very happy to launch the report. Thanks.